Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second webinar of our webinar series on building Nexus resilience, addressing migration and conflicts in water, energy, and food systems. Our webinar today, our second webinar in this series, will focus on integrating migration models and water, energy, food nexus assessments. We have an exciting panel today, and we're looking forward to an engaging discussion on this topic. My name is Bassel, and I'm the Assistant Director for Sustainable Development at the Texas A&M Energy Institute. I'm also part of the leadership team of the SustainFood Network, as well as a board member of the International Water Resource Association, who are co-hosting and co-organizing this webinar today, together with UNU-FLORES and NEXUSNET and SustainFood, and we have the pleasure to have also speakers with us from Columbia Climate School, UNU-EHS, and ULB, Université Libre de Bruxelles. Before we start, I'd also like to give a shout out to Riwa Asir, who is the chair of the Early Career and Young Professionals Task Force at the IWRA, who you will hear from in the chat box throughout the webinar, and will be giving us some directions as we progress in the session. So to provide some framing for this webinar before our panel for today, and to go back to why water, energy, and food. If we look at some of the projections that face us today and some of the grand challenges that face us today, by 2050, we are expected to need more than 55% more water, more than 50 to 60% more food, and more than 80% more energy. And while these are grand challenges and highly complex challenges, they are also very much interconnected. 70% of our fresh water is used by the agricultural sector, 15% of our global fresh water withdrawals go for energy production, and 30% of the world energy is consumed throughout the food supply chain from farm to market. And it shows us the level of interconnectedness between those challenges and the need for really taking a systems approach as we address any of these complex challenges. And that's at a time where more than 2 billion people still lack access to safe drinking water, and more than 700 million people suffer from chronic hunger, and more than 700 million people still lack access to electricity. Now, there's a growing body of research and community of researchers who have been looking at the interconnections of water, energy, and food security challenges, and that's in light of growing pressures of growing population, climate change, urbanization, and shift in land use, which are longer-term trends, as well as different shocks, including COVID, extreme events in different places across the world. One less studied aspect and pressure vis-a-vis these interconnected research challenges is looking at how does migration and displacement, how do migration and displacement interact with this interconnected system of systems? How can water, food, and energy insecurity contribute to trends and flows of migration or displacement, whether it's being a contributor to people's decisions to migrate, but also in what impact do these migration flows or these displacements have on the resource systems of host countries as well. And that's at a time where, according to the latest IOM report, more than 280 million internal migrants globally in 2020, or 3.6% of the world's population is under that category. And where globally at the end of 2022, we had more than 117 million people who were living in displacement, and that's resulting from different conflicts, different wars that we've been seeing over the past 2 years that have resulted in that. And we can see on the figure on the right, a lot of these movements, a lot of these flows can happen within a region or across different regions. So really the image we're painting here is a list of complex, interconnected challenges, cross-regional dimension and aspect to it. So we can all agree that no one discipline and no one region, no one sector is able to address all of this complexity. So, and this is one of the motivations for this webinar series, which is to catalyze a cross-disciplinary, cross-institutional, and international dialogue toward understanding what are the knowledge gaps and opportunities in taking that holistic systems approach to addressing these interconnected challenges at the intersection of migration and water, energy, and food systems. This webinar is again the second out of a three webinar series. We had our first webinar in May 30th, which introduced some of the key interconnections between migration and water, energy, and food systems. And you could go back to our webpage, webinar series webpage, where we have a recording of that webinar, as well as a communication brief, which highlighted some of the key discussions and key research gaps identified during those discussions. Today, we'll be focusing on models and WEF assessments, what opportunities lie in integrating some of these water, energy, food nexus assessments and existing work in migration models. And the third webinar will be later in December, will focus on governance considerations and how we could use those models and those assessments to guide better evidence-based decision-making. Some of the key outcomes that we're expecting and hoping for from this webinar series are to facilitate the development of a common framework and roadmap for integrating migration in Nexus assessment tools. And we're hoping to contribute to exploring and developing anticipatory tools and strategies that incorporate migration dynamics into Nexus assessments, so we could better guide policymakers, researchers, and practitioners toward evidence-based, sustainable, and resilient solutions. Now, to give you a bit of a background on the WEF Nexus side, and we have our panelists today who will give us a flavor of different migration models, and the goal is to have a discussion at the intersection of the work that's being done and within the WEF Nexus community, as well as the migration research. So in the past 10 to 15 years, we've had a growth in this line of research, specifically looking at questions at the intersection of water, energy, and food. And we can see since 2011 and marked by the Bonn conference and moving forward until today, we can see the volume of research literature that's been growing around the topic of water, energy, food nexus, again, over the past 16, 18 years. And that's happening globally within different research networks and different research groups that have been very active in this research space. Here we can see a lot of these networks. You can see our Texas A&M network here. We see UNU with FLORE here, and others from the SustainFood. We can see Chris Scott and others in the WEF Nexus groups that have been active in this space, and as well the different institutions globally that have been active and pushing the research on these interconnected resource systems and developing different tools and different assessments in that space. This is from a systematic literature review by Teguta et al., a recent one which outlined or highlighted 46 WEF Nexus tools since 2009, which have been documented in the literature with different case studies and different applications at different scales across different regions. And these WEF Nexus tools have different methods and different approaches. Some rely on econometrics, others are more output analysis, scenario analysis type tools. Others focus on life cycle assessment, econometric modeling, simulation, looking at a lot of work that does system dynamic modeling, agent-based modeling, as well as others that look at multi-system models. And these are some examples of some of our colleagues who've been working on such tools in this space. And here I'd like to just, for the sake of illustration and to give us a starting point, like to highlight one of the tools that we've been working on here at the Texas A&M, and to give us a sense of the kind of scenarios and outputs metrics we've been looking at. So as part of the Water Energy Food Nexus tool, we've worked on many case studies over the past 10 plus years, looking at evaluating different food, water, energy portfolios, and looking at different sustainability indicators, which do change from one case study to another. But for illustration, they include metrics like looking at water requirement, land requirement, energy requirement, cost, emissions, reliance on foreign markets, and that's especially relevant when we talk about food security, as well as nutrition for different scenarios. And such tools allow us to evaluate the trade-offs associated with different scenarios that could guide evidence-based decision-making and could catalyze a dialogue that needs to happen between these sectors to discuss those trade-offs. Another recent tool we see in the literature, and again, for the sake of illustration here, we see this work by Simpson and Jewett and others in their group, looking at developing a WEF Nexus index for different countries at the national scale, looking at a list of different data points or different metrics that are publicly available, which allows us to get an idea of the water, energy, food nexus performance in terms of access and availability of each of these resources at the country level, which also helps us highlight some of the hotspots or areas that need attention, and as we look at the also interconnections and interrelations between these indices. Now, on the migration side, there's also a lot of work that has been done and adopting different models and different approaches, which again we'll get a flavor of today, from gravity models, radiation models, agent-based models, which utilize different economic and non-economic determinants, or look at climate-driven determinants or behavioral related determinants to predict migration flows. And our focus in this webinar, and given this background that I just provided, is considering the interconnectedness between water, energy, food systems and migration, and which is something we have established in the first webinar and I illustrated earlier in the presentation. How can migration models be integrated into these WEF Nexus assessments? What opportunities lie there? And what are the challenges and opportunities that exist in integrating these migration models into WEF Nexus assessment? Is that something we can do? Is that do we have the right data? Do we have the right resolution? Do we have the right compatibility between the work that we're doing in developing these WEF Nexus assessments and what's being done within the migration space, and what are the current gaps in the research regarding the intersection of WEF and migration? And with that, and before we get started, I'd like to maybe pause for a minute to get a sense of who's with us in the room. I see there's almost 70 people with us in the participants group. Riwa, can we launch the poll? We'll just take 1 minute to get an idea of the region you're joining us from, your organization type and career stage, just so that we get a sense of the group joining us this morning or this evening. I hope you can all see the poll on your screen. I'll just wait a few seconds. If you can just quickly let us know the region you're joining from, the type of your organization and institution, and your career stage. I hope you can all see the poll. I see only a few responded. I don't know if there's a problem because it's showing you that 100% answered, but only 10 responded. So let me stop the poll. I see there's some representation from Africa, Europe, and North America, and we have a good distribution across academic, government, public sector, private sector, as well as also a good distribution across different career stages. It's good to have you all with us this morning, this afternoon, and with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Floor Brouwer, who will be leading the moderation of the panel. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bassel. Well appreciated to set the ground for this very interesting webinar. Let's now continue with the three panelists, and it's my pleasure to introduce the three speakers in the coming half hour or so. And the first speaker is Dr. Alex de Sherbinin, who is director of the Climate School at Columbia University, and also serving as manager of the NASA Socioeconomic Data and Applications Center. He is a geographer with a research interest focusing on the human aspects of global environmental change, very relevant for this afternoon, this morning, and also focusing on geospatial data applications. He is co-author at the World Bank's Groundswell Report Series and the biannual Environmental Performance Index, very important, and teaching in Columbia's Climate and Society and Sustainability Science Master's Degree Program. Dr. de Sherbinin will be the first speaker, and the title of his presentation will be The Importance of Water in Internal Climate Migration Modeling. The second speaker will be Dr. Robert Oakes, who works in the Environment and Migration Division with a focus on interactions and choices in UNU, United Nations University, EHS. He researches the reasons for outcomes of mobility, including evacuation, displacement, voluntary migration, planned relocation, in addition to those who are unwilling or unable to move. The title of his presentation will be Understanding the Nexus and Vulnerability to Improve Migration Models. So Rob will be the second speaker. And then we have the third speaker, Dilare Irbik. She is a PhD candidate at the School of Public Health of the Free University in Brussels, Belgium. She has a Bachelor of Science in Sociology from Middle East Technical University in Turkey, and a degree in Sociology from the University of Mannheim in Germany. She was with the Joint Research Center of the European Commission in Italy and a trainee in the field of multi-level management of international migration, with a special focus on policy and management of those who are bound to fail migrating. And the title of her presentation is Water Migration, Gender Nexus Towards Integrated Governance and Strategies for Migrants, Non-Migrants. So we will have the three speakers, and we plan for a 10 minutes presentation for each, and hopefully Dr. Alex de Sherbinin is ready to start. Alex, the floor is yours.
Laura, thank you so much, and thank you to Bassel for the introduction and for organizing this webinar. Unfortunately, my video camera just stopped working, so I think we have a choice. I can either leave the meeting and come back in and hope that the video monitor video actually works, or I could just go ahead. So whichever you prefer.
I think
we can go ahead, and maybe you could log out and log in for the Q&A later. So
yeah, I can do it after
Sure.
the presentation. So anyway, apologies for that technical glitch. I'm actually not the director of the Climate School. I'm director of a center within the Climate School called CIESIN, CIESIN. We used to be known as Center for International Earth Science Information Network. Now we're changing our name to the Center for Integrated Earth System Information, which obviously fits very well with today's topics. So if you could go to the next slide, I'd appreciate it. So I'll be talking about the importance of water and food in the internal migration modeling that we've been doing with a number of groups. I want to just give credit to various co-authors, including Brian Jones at CUNY Institute for Demographic Research, and Jakob Schewe, who is at PIT, the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impacts Research. They were key partners in this work, along with our partners at the World Bank, including Kanta Rigaud, who is a lead author on groundswell. Next slide, please. So this work, the material that I'm going to be presenting is drawn largely from two initiatives. One is a more recent Africa Climate Mobility Initiative. You can follow the link in the URL there to get more information about that. It was a multi-partner initiative that led to a model and field research on climate migration in Africa specifically. Back, please. And the groundswell report series, which many of you may be familiar with. If you've seen the figure, 260 climate migrants, or up to 260 internal climate migrants by the year 2050. Those numbers come from the groundswell report series, part 1 and part 2. And you can follow those links there to get to those reports. Next slide, please. What was critical to this work was that we followed a scenario-based approach where the model basically, we chose 4 scenarios for the ACMI and 3 scenarios for the groundswell. The 3 groundswell scenarios are in the top left, upper right, and then bottom right. And then we added an optimistic scenario for the ACMI work. And the idea behind this is you couple climate models with future models of development, which are called the shared socioeconomic pathways, or SSPs. On the right side, the development outcomes are inequitable, meaning they're not very positive for humankind and for the well-being of society. On the left side, things are more sustainable and outcomes are better for humans. And then the climate scenarios are high emissions on the top and low emissions on the bottom. So you see how we paired these up. Next animation. So we divided the world up into 4-kilometer grid cell resolution. Actually, ACMI was 1 kilometer, so we did it at a higher resolution. We then derived climate mobility by comparing grid cell level population in a climate impact versus a no climate impact scenario. Next animation, and then the results are aggregated at a national level. It's important to realize that we did not model for this work transboundary or international migration. Next slide. The gravity modeling approach has been around for quite some time, and basically the idea is that over longer historical periods, there's been plenty of empirical evidence to show that people have moved from more rural contexts to more urban contexts, and they do so for a variety of reasons, including the need for better paying jobs, education, the amenities that urban areas provide in terms of services and infrastructure. So this has been a long-term empirical pattern that can now easily be modeled using a gravity model, where you have the mass of the urban areas represented by the, I don't know why I'm being asked now what language I'm speaking in, so I'll just cancel this. So the mass of the mass is represented by the size of the urban area, and the distance is a kind of decay function. The farther the distance, the less likely someone is likely to move from a more rural area to that urban area. So what we simply did was add into this mix of factors that might push people out of rural areas and pull them towards urban areas, environmental and climate impacts that might affect the attractiveness of areas in the receiving areas, the urban areas, and might also affect the push factors or the degree of repelling that rural areas have. So this is a somewhat simplistic top-down model, does not take into account individual characteristics, desires, or a whole range of factors that might be important to know locally about whether someone has a proclivity to move or not. Next slide. So well, I guess all the animations are going at once, but starting from the upper right, you have the world divided into grid cells. Each grid cell is basically, we consider people who move between a 15-kilometer grid cell as having migrated. And so we're really modeling future population distribution. We can imagine a fictional country in which there's a 45 kilometer by 45 kilometers island, for instance, divided into 15-kilometer grid cells. And in the first case, we project forward the population using only development scenarios. And in the second case, we add in the climate scenarios. And you can see in this particular case that more people are moving into the southeastern corner of this fictitious country and moving out of the northwest corner under a climate scenario. So when you subtract one from the other, you basically see areas that are in red are attracting more people under the climate scenario. Next animation. Then you can see for the country Senegal, the areas in red are attracting new people. These are what we call climate migrants. And areas in blue are sending people out of those areas to these new areas of climate in-migration. Next animation. You can then sum up all the positive grid cells, all the red grid cells. Basically, they cancel each other out, right? Blue, if you added blue and red together, you would get 0. But if you add up all the red pixels, you can come up with a cumulative migration over time of people moving out of rural areas and into largely more urban areas or places that are more climate hospitable. So what's important to realize here is that in many of these countries, there'll be already patterns of urbanization that are occurring, but the climate factors may accelerate those in some cases and may decelerate them in others. You may see that in Dakar, there's areas that are slightly shaded in blue that suggest that under a climate scenario, there would be slightly fewer migrants moving into Dakar than there would otherwise have been under a no climate scenario. And that's partly because large areas of Dakar are very low-lying and flood prone. So sea level rise is one of the factors. Next slide. So here you see the kind of combination of scenarios that we include, including crop models, water models for the future water availability. And I'm not going to go into details here because I'll probably run out of time. But if you go to the table on the bottom, what we do is we combine models to basically give us a range of estimates for each of the 4 scenarios I described earlier. So we combine water models with crop models, and then we always have the same sea level rise, and we also added flood risk to the ACMI. So these models come from the intersectoral model intercomparison project, and I will come back to that later because that may be one opportunity for WEF integration. Next slide, please. So what you see here is a map of Africa showing up to 2050, the deviation in water availability on the left-hand side from the historical baseline, and the deviation of crop production in the right-hand side. Actually, I think there's an animation, so click one more time, of crop production and net primary productivity. And that's added, the net primary productivity is basically rangeland and pastoral lands, for the most part, also some forested areas. These are areas that are not currently cropped, where we felt it was important also to understand what would happen in those areas in the future. Blue areas are seeing increases in water or crop production, and red areas, this is an index approach, are seeing against the baseline conditions declines, sometimes up to 80–90% of water availability or crop production. And I think it's important to note that some of those areas that have extreme coloring are also in highly desertified areas, so they're against a very low baseline. Any change in water availability or crop production will show up in the Sahara Desert as being a doubling or tripling potentially of water availability or crop. Anyway, next slide, please. So we also added for the ACMI a flood model that took land out, much like we did with sea level rise. Basically, what we say is that if an area is going to be flooded repeatedly, then that area will see a decline in habitability. And as a result, people will be essentially not moving into those areas. But we said at most 20% of any 4-kilometer grid cell could see a decline in the decline in habitability. Next slide, please. Next slide. So this is where we really get to the crux of the matter for this particular presentation. And what we have here is coefficient estimates derived from a spatial autoregressive model fitted to historic population distribution change. And what we do is we compare the change in historic population distribution from 1990 to 2000 and from 2000 to 2010 to past projections from 1990 to 2000 and 2000 to 2010 using a gravity model. And where there's deviations between what the model produces and what historic changes in population are, we then look at the potential for water availability changes and crop production changes to explain that change in that deviation from what was expected. And so here, what the main point of the red boxes on the right-hand side, if you look across these multiple countries that, please stay in this slide. If you look across the multiple countries for which we calibrated the model, the mean for water availability in urban areas is very high. It's these are normalized indicators, so you can compare them directly against crop production. In urban areas, we only looked at water, but there's a very high predictability for water. And then in the rural areas, water slightly outcompetes crop production in terms of its importance in explaining past deviations in population distribution. In the bottom, you see the groundswell report series. And again, for rural areas, across the board, water typically is a higher predictor than crop productivity in different regions that we calibrated the model. Next slide, please. So we can say that too much water or too little water affects migration. You can go ahead with the animation here. There's a bunch of recent articles that have basically reviewed the relationship between water and migration. The ones, the bullet on the top basically summarizes that flood impacts typically result in short-term displacement, but if they repeat over time, they may result in decisions to move out of flood-affected areas, in other words, permanent migration. And so I give some examples from different river basins in the world. And then on the bottom bullet, drought and secular trends in rainfall decrease. In other words, changes in deviations from the norm in rainfall, the decreases in rainfall, and temperature increases, which results in higher evapotranspiration, can result in declining agricultural yields, which impacts livelihoods in ways that may result in decisions to migrate. I think it's also important to say that in some cases, what we're seeing is that people may be unable to migrate. They don't have the capability to migrate because their agricultural livelihoods have been so eroded. Next slide, please. And this is next to my last slide. Basically, another paper we did recently looked specifically at the agricultural pathway, which is an often cited causal mechanism, which asserts that changes in crop productivity are a likely driver for migration. We've seen that statistical analyses do consistently show that deviations in temperature and precipitation that may affect crop production do result in migration, increased migration in these very carefully calibrated statistical studies. But we don't really understand the precise mechanisms. So what we do with this flow chart, and you don't need to look at the details, but basically we say, in order to really understand the causal mechanisms, you have to go from the climate variables to the food production, to the rural household livelihood and diversification of those livelihoods, to the decision to migrate. And very few studies do that. So in this, what I would say, and the bottom line is that basically food production could be a driver of either immobility or mobility, depending on how things turn out in the local rural context. Last slide. You can do the animation again, but essentially water availability and hydrological hazards, along with other climate-related factors, are rarely the most significant factor affecting migration decision-making. So people do not make a decision purely on the change in water or change in necessarily in crop-relevant variables, but they do make decisions based on their livelihoods. Their influence is more than the greater influence tends to be economic and social factors. We're finding this again and again in the research. And the projections really are contingent on a whole range of social and political variables. But habitability concerns are rising on the agenda. And this article on the right is basically one attempt to kind of look at these issues, both from a top-down and a bottom-up perspective. So the last slide is just my references, and I apologize for going slightly over. Thank you so much, Bassel.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Sherbinin, and we will take time after the three presentations for discussion. Dr. Robert Oakes will now clarify about understanding the nexus and vulnerability to improve migration models. Please, the floor is yours, Rob.
Thank you very much, Floor, and thank you, Bassel, for hosting as well. Yes, so, well, slide, actually, please. So, yeah, as has been suggested, I'm going to try and bring together some of those ideas about migration and the nexus, but specifically from a vulnerability lens. And my presentation is a little bit less technical than Alex's, so I think it's quite a nice combination, a bit complementary. So here I'm kind of looking at approaches to modeling more than the kind of technical detail of how to do it. Slide, please. Okay, so essentially what I argue here is that until now, most modeling of environmental migration has been a very kind of physical science approach, looking at hazards, exposure, and not so much of a focus on vulnerability. And when vulnerability is addressed, it tends to be looked at from a very technical approach without kind of drilling down into the social, economic, cultural drivers of vulnerability. And on the flip side of that, agency is also ignored if people are sort of assumed to be vulnerable due to their location or their economic circumstance. It's not looking at the whole picture. So I'm going to very briefly look at a couple of models that I've produced or worked on recently, which try and look at this from a slightly different perspective from those which, for example, Alex outlined earlier. So I'll talk very briefly about an agent-based model that I developed for the Pacific, and then what we're doing at UNU at the moment, trying to look at displacement. Slide, please. So an ABM, an agent-based model that we developed for the Pacific Small Island Development State. So this was under the Pacific Climate Change Model that we did this work a few years ago under United Nations SCAP. And basically what we did here was we produced a large N household survey to produce data on households' living situation before and after migration to try and understand the impacts of migration. I think in the end we found it a bit difficult to to find the links and the causality between moving and outcomes. But what it was very useful for, we thought, was triggers, and a lot of these, of course, relate to the WEF. So as you're no doubt aware, in the Pacific, there's a range of climate-related impacts which are affecting households. So we did a survey, and we found on the left, you can see the chart here, the vast majority of households have been affected by at least one impact related to climate. So it's basically too much water or not enough water, which is sometimes not known before you sort of dig into this in a bit more detail. So I put here that WEF is a big challenge. I can't say that energy was a focus on this, but water and food definitely, and their interaction. So what we found was that in the countries that we looked in, Kiribati, Tuvalu, and Nauru, there's quite a lot of internal mobility within the countries, maybe a little bit of international mobility, and quite a lot of people who weren't able to move, or the so-called trapped populations. And a lot of this mobility was actually, we think, due to environmental conditions. We actually asked them, what was the main reason that you moved? Was it economic? Was it environmental? Was it education? And quite a lot of these movements were environmental. Slide, please. So I won't go into detail on this, but the way that I actually modeled it was I adapted a version of the aspirations and capability approach. I didn't use that terminology at the time, actually, but essentially we're trying to look at aspiration, the need to move, capability, the ability to move. So in terms of aspiration, we just looked at the observed data from in the past 10 years, and we tried to map how that would develop with climate change and changes in demographic trends in terms of gender and age. And we put in a social network to get people to kind of convince each other to move, or to move as a friendly, and the role of diaspora communities. The capability aspect we modeled by creating a vulnerability index. So the more vulnerable the households were, the least likely they were to be able to afford migration. And I mean afford in terms of finance, but also the social and cultural capitals you need to move. If they move, then the vulnerability index of their networks actually change. And in this way that they, one household or one person moving can actually trigger or make more likely that his or her social network would actually move. Slide, please. What we found in this, if you can see the top, we looked at what would happen to the islands. So in terms of Kiribati, we found that the population of the country as a whole would increase quite a lot from the 210 census to 2055, which was the end of our model. And what we also found was, in particular, populations would be slightly concentrated in the capital island of Tarawa. And this was a similar finding in Tuvalu also, that people moved to Funafuti, the capital. And we found this is a bit of a combination of existing flows and developmental trends, whereby it's a form of urbanization where people move from the outer islands to the capital islands. And then I made a simple diagram at the bottom there that kind of explains how, if there's an aspiration to move and if there's a capability, then there might be migration. And in the end, this can translate into adaptive forms of migration, which is in green, or sort of the less adaptive forms if people are actually not able to move. So if you look at the photo in the top corner, it says the highest point on South Tarawa is actually 3 meters above sea level. So what we find is we have a concentration of people in the capital island, and in the same way that people are moving because of impacts on food and water, when they actually arrive at the capital island, they might be intensifying this risk because a larger population is living on this island, and it kind of raises questions about is the carrying capacity being tested. I'm not a deterministic researcher. I don't necessarily believe in carrying capacity. However, in an island context, I think it is a reasonable assumption to make. And I think it also makes the idea of modeling at the island level or small scale model, which you can sort of draw boundaries about where people can move and you can analyze the systems in an island, makes it quite amenable to modeling. Slide, please. Okay, and very briefly for displacement, this is some ongoing work that we've been doing at UNU with the Internal Monitoring Displacement Center, IDMC, and ETH Zurich under the Climada model, which was developed by ETH Zurich. So Climada just means climate adapt, and it's a quite well-established natural hazard model. So it models a range of different natural hazards and how they would interact with exposed populations. Until now, as you could see from the diagram, the vulnerability of populations is a little bit simplistic because it's just limited to, essentially, it's another form of exposure. So it's the housing, you can see it's broken down into probability of housing being destroyed or damaged, essentially. So what we're trying to do at the moment is to bring in some agency and decision-making, referring back to what I was saying earlier, the need to kind of expand modeling to bring this human element in. So I don't have any results to show at the moment. I'm just going to briefly talk about how we've progressed with this and how we've designed it. Slide, please. So what we try to do is bring in a bit more of the idea that Alex mentioned at the end of his presentation about how migration decisions are, they're about food, they're about energy, they're about water, but they're about livelihoods, and they're about the kind of social, economic, political factors which are interacting with this. So we're going back to basics to understand this quite famous or maybe even infamous model. If you've looked into environmental mobility, the Black Foresight model of how migration decisions are made. And while this is made for migration, we're trying to apply it for displacement. Slide, please.
Could you wrap up in a minute or so?
I will, thank you, Flor. So you can see here a very ugly slide, which I've deliberately included to show that our workings. We're trying to recreate this in terms of how we can bring together various forms of data. We found it a bit difficult, actually. So slide. What we did in the end was look at the risk-informed approach, which was developed by the European Union. And there's an animation here. We decided to focus on what they call vulnerability and coping capacity. And slide, please. It's ongoing work, but at the moment we've kind of narrowed it down. This isn't the final version, actually, an animation. Those which are highlighted show the kind of WEF aspect. So what we have here is a lot of quantitative data, and a lot of this can be found on, for example, EU or global databases. What we're also bringing in is some spatial data as well, just to try and really bring in the way that people interact with the environment to get a sort of a truer representation of risk. Slide, please. And there's 3 animations here. Just do them, please. Okay, so when migration is being modeled, it tends to focus on mobility, which we can say is just maybe one aspect of how the capability to migrate and the aspiration to migrate actually interact. So it's very important to look at how people move, but to do this, we have to think of both the capability and the aspiration. I think that what's necessary in all forms of probably climate mobility research, but especially in modeling, is to look at both of these. So not just how risk is created, but also how people actually interpret and operationalize that risk. I'll wrap up there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. Well appreciated. And we will now continue to the presentation with Dilare. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Hello, thank you very much for organizing this webinar. Today I will talk about water migration gender nexus. My talk will cover mostly a gender aspect. Slide, please. Next, yes. Climate change manifests itself as global warming, worsening the present water resources. Water problems such as water scarcity or sea level rise may result in social and economic difficulties, political conflict, food security, or health outcomes. Next slide, please. Water problems due to climate change might be also direct or indirect push factors for voluntary or forced migration. As a strategy, safe and orderly migration in case of water stress can contribute to economic growth in the host communities. On the other hand, as a challenge, the most vulnerable people have limited opportunity to migrate, and they have to stay in the risky areas and must adapt to environmental challenges. Even though those people migrate for a better life, they may face several problems in urban areas because most likely those people live in scattered houses without a good water infrastructure. Next slide, please. Climate change exacerbates water scarcity and access with a significant gender inequality, both within and outside home. For example, water insecurity is particularly burdensome to women during their vulnerable periods like pregnancy or postpartum because their physical health is affected by a lack of nutrition. Next slide, please. Although climate change and water-related dimension of migration have been widely studied, a gender lens on this topic is scarce in the existing research literature. But the perception and response of women and men towards climate change are different. Therefore, understanding these challenges requires analyzing the social relations and power structures to determine more case-specific strategies. Therefore, we need a critical and holistic approach that highlights women's constraints and needs within water-related problems and migration settings. Next slide, please. To bring a gendered lens to this topic, I conducted a systematic literature review and proposed a conceptual framework, as you can see on the slide, that combines feminist political ecology with integrated governance strategies that could synergistically mitigate the water and migration challenges. Before explaining how I combined the result of my review with this conceptual framework, I will briefly explain what feminist political ecology is. The central idea of it is that men and women have different experiences concerning the human-nature interactions, and gender differences are constructed socially, not biologically, resulting in divergence in culture, class, race, and place. There are three components of feminist political ecology, which are policy and implementation, knowledge, rights, and responsibilities. This approach gives prominence to environmental justice and seeks to explain the origins and causes of this injustice, which are caused by social relations or power structures. It is a holistic approach revealing the interactions between environment and politics on a local to global scale, and it aims to analyze how these interactions are gendered in order to decrease gender inequalities. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, I conducted a systematic literature review to map the existing case studies covering water, migration, and gender nexus. You can see some main findings here. I analyzed 67 peer-reviewed articles to collect the recommendations for the impact of climate change on water and water problems on migration, non-migration, with the intersection of gender. Most studies were conducted in Bangladesh, India, and Kenya. The prominent water resources outcomes were food, water security, water infrastructure, and infectious diseases. Existing case studies mainly focus on four thematic areas: technological, socioeconomic, political, and health aspects of water migration nexus. Next slide, please. From this systematic review, what we learned in the existing case studies mainly suggest individual solutions rather than integrated solutions to the water and migration problems. And but we need a gender dimension to solve more complex and multifaceted problems. faced by environmental migrants, more specifically women. Therefore, a conceptual framework combining feminist political ecology with integrated governance strategies may alleviate their problems through evidence-based, sustainable, and resilient solutions. In that way, women can be more resilient to the social, economic, and environmental changes in their life. How we can achieve that? Based on these existing policies resulted from the systematic review, we can use following strategies to enhance the feminist political ecology in understanding water-related and migration context. First, holistic policy and implementation. This requires integrative approaches, which bring several disciplines and policy sectors together. Second, equal knowledge creation and dissemination among men and women. Through this, women would benefit from knowledge sharing that might help them respond to the challenges of building sustainable livelihoods in the face of climate change and water resources. And as a third strategy, increasing women's rights and responsibilities, meaning that gender aspects should be touched upon extensively in political conflict discourse, and the adaptation strategies should be rearranged by considering the sociocultural dimension of gender aspects, which are embedded in traditional practices. Yeah, this is the end of my talk, and next you can see some further research questions that can be analyzed, and also my reference list. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dilare. I'm sure we will come to some further questions. There are several questions mentioned in the chat, and let me try to come to them. And Bassel, I think we could check about the question about the WhatsApp or LinkedIn group maybe at the end of the webinar.
Yep. Yep.
And then I have a question to each of the panelists, and maybe the first question to Alex. There was a question about whether voluntary migration could be separated from climate-induced displacement. That is, of course, a very specific and extremely relevant question, I think. And maybe we could extend that to a question we developed in advance and we discussed last week about data availability. And could you briefly reflect on whether we have the right data and where you see the real need for improving data availability and access to data? And hopefully you're connected, Alex. Is Alex connected? Yeah. Maybe we start with Rob then, if it's fine.
Yes, hi. So the same question.
Sorry?
I can try that question or something else.
I have a different question. There was a comment about whether Climada is publicly available. And then there was a question about whether there is knowledge about whether there is data available and knowledge about the age of population and the regions people migrate between the north and south or east and west. And related to that, in terms of knowledge, is this all adequately addressed? Is it state of the art of, what is the state of the art of migration modeling in terms of people leaving a region and the region of destination? Data availability and publicly available tools, it would be relevant to see what is the state of the art and possible knowledge gaps. If you could comment on that, Rob.
Okay, thanks. Yes, so in terms of Climada, yes, it's freely available. I'll insert a link in a minute when I have time. And I think the question also said, is it possible to get socioeconomic data? Yeah. So partly what we're trying to do is to build upon Climada, so to extend it. So most of the work within this mini project is improving the level of detail, so going down to mapping things by 1 kilometer, so we can get better hazard and better exposure layers. Our vulnerability element is one part of this, which is trying to bring a bit more human element to it. That hasn't been included into the model yet because we're not quite ready for it. So it's a post-processing stage at the moment. So in effect, the model remains rather physical, but we're putting a bit more of a different kind of probability through with the post-processing. We hope to incorporate this, bringing in this socioeconomic data at a later stage. In terms of age, this is an excellent question. So actually, Alex and I have been involved with working with UNICEF to try and produce better knowledge, better data about the way that children are affected, for example. And I think this is true about most groups. When data is available, sometimes it's not broken down by even gender, age, disability, for example. And of course, this translates into modeling. If there's no baseline data, it's more difficult to model, but it's something which is being improved upon. And in terms of regions, so it's a bit difficult to say, really. So some models only look at internal displacement. So the model I was discussing is about internal displacement. I see Alex is back online, so maybe he'd like to talk about this. But essentially, it's a bit difficult to say what's going to happen between regions. All we can say for sure, well, I would say for sure, is that there will be more climate-related events which produce more triggers for mobility. This likely won't result in huge movements of people from the global south to the global north, despite what the media and what policy might think might happen. I don't know, Alex, you're back now. I don't know if you want to pick up on that.
And Alex, maybe there was I think you're muted, but there was, hopefully you can hear us.
I hear you, and I just was given the ability to unmute my mic. So yes, thanks. And sorry, I had to miss the first question.
I come to that.
Yeah, so yeah, I agree with Robert. I mean, we're fellow travelers, basically. I think we'd agree with 90% of what each other presents. I'm not sure he likes the groundswell model per se. I won't put words into his mouth. The groundswell was obviously just a first approximation, an effort to get some of these issues on the table, I would say, and the model proved to be a way to kind of capture attention that might not otherwise have been garnered if you simply did another literature review, of which there are many, many, many. And I think that it sort of was a case of diminishing returns. And as a geographer, there's always this struggle between the particularities of any given place and what can be generalizable. And we, I think, tried to tread that line carefully, but also recognize the limitations. And so I would just say one other thing. We are planning a workshop later this month, actually, at Princeton with colleagues at Princeton and Cornell University, where we'll be looking very carefully at the pros and cons of the different modeling approaches to better understand which ones are appropriate in which contexts, and how to better capture through ABMs and system dynamic and other models, the local context and the local decision-making and the aspirations and capabilities of migrants that Robert so ably described in his presentation. Sorry, I'll stop there because I'm probably going off track now.
No, but there was another question during your presentation, Alex, about the possibility to separate voluntary migration from climate-induced displacement. And that probably relates also to the broader question of data availability and data constraints.
Yeah.
And maybe you could comment on that as well.
Yeah.
That might be relevant for future work.
Right. Well, you know, Graham Hugo, now 25 to 30 years ago, talked about this continuum from voluntary to forced. And even the construct of what's voluntary or what's not. I mean, you can go into kind of philosophy and at what point do people make decisions out of free will, and at what point are they constrained by their circumstances? And one person's set of constraints might be another person's free will. So these are really like deeper philosophical questions, so I'm not going to go there. I would just say that typically climate migration has been characterized as a form of forced migration, but there's also this notion of migration as adaptation, where people are freely making decisions to move away from areas where the future looks less promising to areas where they perceive the future to be more promising. And so that's sort of a voluntary form of migration. There's critiques of that as well that basically say, well, you're just putting on the poor people of this world the responsibility for adapting to circumstances that are actually, as Dilare so eloquently expressed, not their making, right? Climate change is not the responsibility of the poor of this world, the low-income countries. It's largely the manufactured by the global north. So there's huge justice and other concerns. Getting to the question of data, yeah, of course, data in the migration sphere are extremely difficult to come by. We're plumbing a lot of different novel data sources, but none of them are a silver bullet. So we're working with IOM's data on flow monitoring in West Africa. We're working with data on border apprehensions in the US and Europe. We're working with Twitter data to understand migration motivations in two regions, West Africa and Central America. And so the question of what people are really thinking, though, and what makes them move, this question of drivers and root causes, is being very contested these days. And I think it's very healthy and very helpful that people are questioning, you know, this idea that economic drivers are preeminent or that labor migration is a primary factor. I think people's motivations are often highly complex. Their emotional lives, their lived experience, their cultural backgrounds and embeddedness, all of these affect the degree to which people move for, you know, based on various stimuli. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I have a question to Dilare. I think you elegantly expressed the need for a holistic approach in the connection between the Nexus and migration modeling. And in preparing the webinar, we discussed about potential benefits and opportunities from successfully integrating Nexus assessments and migration modeling. Would you argue that by better connecting the Nexus assessment with migration models would be achieved through capturing gender dimension?
Yes, exactly. Actually, the role of women in water, energy, food nexus is essential. Therefore, the impact of gender-specific roles between female and male-headed households on the nexus resources in rural and urban settings should be highlighted. To do so, actually, we can use agent-based modelings and we approach, and this enables us to simulate the predicted effects under different scenarios of population growth, for example. In that way, it is possible to capture the gender-specific responses to, for example, modern bioenergy interventions to address current energy crisis that may reduce or enhance synergies among nexus resources. And to capture these gender aspects, we can also use some gender index metrics, which uses participatory methodology to facilitate the definition and the analysis of gender issues by the communities. So yes, it is
Okay.
possible to use to collect data on migration, and with different statistical analysis, we can capture this gender dimension, including different sectors, stakeholders, and policymakers. We can make more intersectional analysis.
In your systematic literature review, did you find any focus on gender impacts that should be accounted for in these integrated assessments?
Specifically to water, energy, food assessments, you mean?
Yeah. What kind of gender impacts to consider? Because you mentioned about the gender index, that looks
This is another approach. I didn't use this gender analysis metrics. It is just a proposal to how we integrate gender to water, energy, food assessments, actually.
okay.
I just look the gaps. What are the challenges? What kind of challenges women have with regard to water and migration? But my work, of course, can be enlarged and furthered through this WEF assessments, actually.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Reba, are there other questions pending from the discussion?
Flor, I don't see pending questions, but if I may, I have a question reflecting on the discussion and kind of what we heard from the different presentations, and I'm trying to think. This is the beginning of a discussion on how we could find entry points for looking at identifying opportunities for having these models, these approaches complement each other or feed into one another. And I have a few reflections, mainly maybe building on what Rob last presented on the equation of risk for migration. And I'm wondering whether you see how we calculate vulnerability, how we frame vulnerability there and calculate it might benefit from some of the analysis of these water, energy, food nexus indices or hotspots that we highlight through different case studies and through analysis. And while that in combination with also the different socioeconomic factors, metrics, and all the dimensions you talked about in terms of aspirations and capability, which was also very interesting. I'm wondering if the vulnerability part of the equation could be an entry point for maybe expanding how we look at that vulnerability to incorporate some of the analysis we do in the water, energy, food nexus assessment space.
Rob, you want to follow up on this?
Yes, thanks, Bassel. Yeah, I think this was more or less the idea that we had in mind when we were attempting to extend the Climada model, just because there's so many aspects to vulnerability. So classically, if we're thinking about climate mobility, vulnerability is very much about socioeconomic vulnerability. So we'd say essentially the poorest people are more likely to be affected and therefore more likely to want to move if they can move. But what I think the WEF framing enables us to do, brain power and resources permitting, is to really extend this and try and understand. So as Alex mentioned in his presentation, it's about livelihoods. It's the way that people are interacting with the environment, and that's a kind of bi-directional flow. And it's important to try and really understand that, and then we can attempt to model it. So it's about interactions with water and the way that water is interacting with food and energy. And as Dilare said, there are also different members of societies who will interact in different ways. So ideally, what we also need to do is look at how children and women and ethnic minorities are involved in this process as well. So I think it is challenging, but I think that is what should be next, to bring these two worlds together, because until now they haven't been so well integrated.
Thank you, Rob. Alex?
Okay, thanks. So the vulnerability construct is really critical here. We're also working at our center season on some efforts to do. We have now what's called the Global Gridded Relative Deprivation Index. So it's an effort to kind of combine satellite data with socioeconomic data to produce a global map of relative levels of deprivation. Imperfect, we're working on a version 1.1 and actually close on its heels of version 2, which we hope corrects some issues that we found in the first version. But so, finding ways of measuring whether people are more or less likely to be able to move, the capability is, I think, a critical issue in climate migration research. And the real concern that's rising on the agenda is the number of people who are likely to be trapped, as Robert put it, or involuntarily immobile, people who are unable to move. I did want to mention one opportunity that I think may exist, and this is a community that I don't know well, the WEF and kind of assessment community. So I wanted to just bring it up. I mentioned earlier the ICIMIP project, the Intersectoral Impact Model Intercomparison Project. These are process-based models. They're very physically based. Robert pointed out that, a lot of the modeling to date has been driven by earth scientists and physical scientists, because that's often where the data are, and that's also their native language is quantitative modeling. So they're really able to do it in a way that I think outstrips at least the ways that we've been able to do social science modeling, and because humans are also just much more complex to model. But the ICIMIP offers an opportunity to potentially, for the WEF community, to insert itself in these discussions and maybe even drive a bit of the way that modeling is done by coupling things like water to crop production. And also I think they model future energy systems and things like that. There are a number of models that the Intersectoral Impact Model and Comparison Project ICIMIP has done for the health sector, for forests, is quite staggering. And so I think that's one area where you all might be able to insert yourselves. I realize some of the WEF assessment work is done at this level of global trade models and kind of at a much higher macro level of state to state. But I think to get down to the level of modeling things at subnational levels is really going to be critical as you start to explore these issues more in depth. Thanks.
Thank you, Alex.
Maybe we could follow up, link to this, a question from Julian Prieto. How to distinguish or disentangle economic and social reasons to those coming from climate change reasons? Aren't they highly correlated? That would be quite interesting. Would you be willing, Alex, to comment on this?
I can start. Robert certainly will have a lot to say, as well as Dilare. I don't think you can. So let's be honest, we're not going to be able to, people don't move across borders or move within countries with a big badge that says I'm a climate migrant. They move because of a complex mix of factors. And this is the sort of nut of what I've been trying to convey, over the last hour. And so I think that I call it the messy mix of factors, the growing insecurity in some parts of the world. I think people move partly because they have aspirations, they can't meet locally, but also because they're seeking a more predictable future. So when people are moving across borders, my sense is that part of it is security and safety. You see this as people are moving up through Central America across the Darien Gap. You see it, in these extreme cases of irregular migration that are occurring in the world. It's partly safety and security, but it's partly like, I just want some predictability in my life. And where I live currently, there's just not a lot of predictability. And so those are governance factors, those are conflict, those are gang-related activities, narco-trafficking, you name it. These are factors that are affecting people's decisions to migrate. So I'll stop there. I'd love to hear from Robert and Dilare.
Dilare, thank you very much. Dilare, would you like to share your findings maybe from your previous work on this very broad topic? It's not essential. If you prefer not, of course, that's...
Yeah, this is not the aspects I look for from my review, because this sounds very statistical question to me, so I would rather skip this question.
Okay, yes. And Rob, maybe you want to remark, and then I think, Bassel, we come to a close with this part of the program.
Yes, so I would say that I essentially agree with Alex that it may not be possible and it may not matter to the person who's moving or the end result. If we're thinking about there might be a government which should be addressing this movement or dealing with this movement as well. Nonetheless, if we're thinking about how we can project and think about what might happen in the future, it's still worth us trying to. I think it's just worth recognizing how problematic it is, and we've spoken about the multi-causality of any sort of decision. So yes, it's problematic, and if we think about people in the global south where most of these movements are happening, of course your livelihood, your personal economic situation is very much connected to local environmental and economic conditions. People are affected through their livelihoods. So separating them is, as you say, that they're very highly correlated, very difficult to separate them. Sometimes it's important if we can think about trying to create some sort of understanding of how we can address this. It's still nonetheless important to try and not separate them, but understand the way through which the environment conditions flows. It doesn't necessarily cause flows, it conditions existing flows, let's say.
Thank you very much. I think we come to a close for this part of the program. I think we might not have fully captured the questions that Bassel presented at the start of the webinar. I think some questions were delved into more detail than others. And I of course want to express appreciation to Alexis Sherbinin, Robert Oakes, and Dilare Irbik to present their work. It's really the flavor of the webinar, and there are several questions left in the chat that we plan to follow up in the near future. And I think, Bassel, it's up to you to advance.
Thank you very much, Floor, and I join you also in thanking our panelists for really insightful presentations, and thank you again for taking the time and sharing your work with us, and really showing us and demonstrating through this discussion the complexity of this topic, and making us realize even more how interdisciplinary this topic is, and emphasizing the importance of socioeconomic aspects, and in addition to looking at it from a lens of resource availability and resource scarcity, which in fact doesn't contradict with a lot of reviews on, as we look at a lot of the root causes for insecurity and lack of availability of resources in many countries, which end up boiling down to governance related aspects and more socioeconomic aspects that drive decisions, causing a lot of the pressures on the resource system. So I think through this discussion we highlighted the complexity, but also a few entry points for looking at these models and these assessments and opportunities for integrating those, which will hopefully capture in a communication brief that will be shared following this webinar, that will capture some of the highlights of our speakers' presentations, as well as the dialogue. So to remind you, this was today was the second webinar of a 3-webinar series. I invite you to check out our webinar series website, which will have a documentation of all the recordings for these webinars, the presentations, as well as the communication briefs that will highlight key messages and research gaps identified in the discussions. I'd also like to invite you to register soon or be on the lookout for our third webinar announcement, which will focus on governance considerations and evidence-based policy making. So our discussion today focused more on the models. We're going to take the discussion to another level also, and ask how we could use those models and how they could inform better evidence-based decision making, and what governance considerations need to be taken as we look at migration vis-a-vis the water, energy, food, interconnected resource challenges. So thank you again for those who joined us, and look forward to seeing you on December 3rd.
Thank you, Bassel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bassel. Thanks, Flora.
I need to remind you, please, to fill out the form that we just posted on the chat box to get your feedback. That would be great. Thank you so much all for attending this session, and hopefully we'll see you in our upcoming webinar as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Riwa. Thank you.